Now the sun shone for days on end. Blossoms rode on the fruit trees or lay scattered around the trunks. In the fields, the corn was pushing through the ground, and in the garden, the early seeds were showing above the ground, the vegetables Andrew had planted, and the flowers near the house that were Martha's. Such fine weather meant but one thing for the flock, that it was time for shearing. Andrew went into the village one evening and came back a few hours later with the good news that the shearer would be at hand to do their work the next morning. The floor of the barn had been swept clean in preparation, and soon after daybreak the lambs were separated from the ewes and left grazing in the meadow, while the ewes were brought to the barn. Some of the yearlings bleated anxiously, but the older sheep, as if remembering, stood patiently waiting for their moment. Andrew and Benj would grasp a sheep by its leg and with a skillful motion turn it onto its back, holding it down. Then with a quick running of shears over its body, the shearer would clip off the fleece. More often than not, it came off all in one piece, like a coat, heavy and greasy and worth its weight in the wool market. The fleece was tossed into a box built for the purpose, and it was Peter's job to tramp the fleeces down. The sheep, released of the heavy load it had been carrying all through the winter and spring, leaped to its feet and clattered quickly out of the barn and into the meadow. But oh, the strangeness of it all, for now the mothers were not very much larger than their lambs and had no dignity at all. The lambs eyed them suspiciously, not at all certain they wished to claim these pink-fleshed, ungainly creatures as their mothers. Crowding together in a corner, they baaed arrogantly. The ewes crowded together in an opposite corner, baaing beseechingly. One by one, the lambs, drawn by that insatiable urge of hunger, came forward and sniffed around until each one found the right one, then dropping down, drew milk for its needs. Scampering away, they shook their heads in delight, for the milk was the same, though the source it came from was so altered. The shearer mopped its head and cleaned his shears, while Andrew tied the fleeces into bales, and Benj swept the floor. "They'll fetch a good price," the shearer said, "and wool is up this year." Andrew smiled proudly. "It's good feed that makes fine wool." "I wish all shepherds heeded that," the shearer nodded. "Some will let the sheep eat brush and scrub, and then wonder why the wool doesn't weigh more." "They'll eat the brush and scrub," Andrew agreed, "for there's no better way to keep land clean than with a flock of sheep. But they need rich pasture, too, and hay in the winter and grain in the spring. They repay care more than double, as most growing things will." After the shearing, Andrew waited for a warm, windless day for the dipping. Nearly 2 weeks went by. The dip was strong, and he wanted to be sure the occasional nicks and cuts made by the shears had all healed. A tank was filled with warm water, and the dip mixed into it. Then one at a time, the sheep were immersed in it, even their heads, so no lice or ticks could be harbored anywhere while their fleece grew again. The lambs were dipped too, and here again the Cosset, going first, showed herself for the born leader she was coming to be. This done, the flock was now ready to take its part in the summer that was at hand. Up in the hills, a whole day's journey at sheep pace, were green, safe pastures where ewes and lambs could be turned out for grazing. Benj and Peter set out one morning with the flock. It was a long journey, uphill all the way, but the sheep moved with a nimbleness their great coats had kept them from having, and some even thought they were lambs in moments of frolic. It was afternoon when they reached the pasture, rounded grassy knobs of hills, with a brook racing down a slope, and trees casting pools of shade. Benj had come up earlier in the spring with blocks of salt. He had strengthened the fences running at the base of the hill, and made sure that the flock would be safe and happy. "Aren't you saying goodbye to the Cosset?" Benj asked when it was time for them to go home. "She's not staying up here, is she?" Peter replied in surprise. "She's eating grass now, like the others, isn't she? Then it's time for her to pasture with the others. She won't forget you." Peter put his arms around the cosset. Benj watched them, thinking that when next they saw each other, Peter would still be a little boy, while the lamb would be almost a full-grown sheep. As they went down the hill, a small bleating followed them. Peter looked back and waved so often that finally Benj said, "It's better not to look back. Keep your eyes ahead of you." "But ahead, there's only the path down to the valley." "True," Benj nodded, "but there's much to see along it." "I don't care for anything but my cosset," Peter said stubbornly. The old man went on as if he had not heard. "There are many things in the world. If we care for them all a little, we won't feel the hurt too much when we part with one." Peter often thought of those words as the summer went on, for the summer days were such busy ones. Indeed, he wondered if he and the cosset would ever have had time for any games. There was work in the garden, in the fields with the crops, in the woods gathering berries. Each day made its demands, and because the work had to be done and was to help them all, answering them seemed better than playing games. There were quiet times, too, when his mother told stories to him, and beautiful, clean days like Sundays when they wore their best clothes and went to the village church. And all through the summer, with its hot sun and cool rains, the seeds they had planted grew and flourished till they became crops ready to be harvested. One morning after a day of rain, the sun coming over the mountains showed a fine dusting of snow on their peaks. That was the day they brought the flock down from the pastures. The sheep were hardly recognizable, so fat were they, with such heavy fleeces again, and the lambs, only old Benj could tell them from their mothers. In the midst of the flock stood a sheep, dark brown and heavily wooled. Peter gave his low whistling call. The pointed ears pricked at the sound. The dark head shook. Then, pushing the others out of its way, the cosset ran toward the boy. "See, Benj, she's not forgotten me," Peter said, hugging his pet. "No living thing forgets a kindness, and you were kind to her when she most needed it." "She knows me! She knows me!" Peter shouted. "My little cosset knows me!" "She'll know you all her life, but she's a cosset no longer. A grown sheep is worthy of a name." Peter thought for a moment. "She shall be called Biddy from this time on," he said. With Rollo's help, they counted the sheep as they passed through the narrow gate. Satisfied that all were there, they followed the flock down to the farm, for the lead ewes knew the way. They had traveled it often and could not forget. It was the road that led home. Andrew and Benj spent the next day culling the flock. Peter, watching them at it, thought that it was like thinning vegetables in a garden, so the remaining ones might grow stronger. The good ewes and most of the yearlings were turned into a meadow near the barn. The old ewes, those who were poor milkers, and those who had not dropped strong lambs, and all the ram lambs were kept in the barnyard. These were the ones that would go to market. They would fetch good money, and the flock would be better for the culling. "First the wool and then the mutton, that's the shepherd's life," Andrew said as he went over the sheep in the barnyard. "For people must be clothed and fed, and the sheep can do both for them." In a day or two, he would come back from the trip to the market town, looking jovial for the money he knew was in the bank, bringing something to Martha which she had long needed for the house, the promise of a new plow in the spring to old Benj, and a book or toy for Peter. He would have with him the finest ram in the countryside, who would be turned out with the ewes in the meadow. "It's the way the world goes round," Martha mused. "What one has meets another's need. We have sheep, and the townspeople have money. We make a small exchange with them, and then we have money for the things we need." "It's lonely with the ram lambs all gone away," Peter said. "There'll be more lambs in the spring," Martha reminded him. "And when it comes time for shearing, Biddy's wool will make a coat for you." That was how the year went, and now that Peter was nearly 7, he could take part in it. Other years he had been at play when the great activities took place, the lambing and shearing, the dipping and pasturing and culling. Now he could take a man's part and help his father, and because his father had another pair of hands, small though they were, he could afford to let the flock grow that much bigger. The winter passed with its bright chill outdoors and warm cheer within. The sheep stayed in the barn when the snow lay deep and fed on the hay and grain that had been grown for them. On fair days, the sheep went into the barnyard, stepping daintily through the snow and pawing it away to uncover tufts of grass. But if there was ice, the sheep were never let out of the barn. Andrew would take no risks with them, as they were growing heavy now with their lambs. These winter days, the farm demanded less time, and the house could have more. There were hours spent in the big warm kitchen, Martha busy knitting, Benj mending harness or tools, Andrew reading aloud. Peter would sit on the floor hugging his knees, using Biddy for a backrest. Big as she was, the black sheep was allowed in the house, as in her early days, and still chose to sleep in her pen in the shed. Martha called her a nuisance, clicking about the floors on her small, sharp hooves, nosing into any salt she could find, nibbling at potatoes or turnips or whatever took her fancy. But Martha forgave her anything. Always in her mind was the memory of the day when she had held a lifeless lamb in her arms, and Benj had put his bearded lips to the small black nostrils and breathed into them. And with her mind's eye, Martha looked ahead to the shearing and beyond, to that cloth spun and woven from the fleece, a cloth so dark and rich in color that no dye could match or better it, and would outwear all other wool. When the March winds blew, first warm and soft, then chill and raw, the lambs came, such a wonderful crop of them, half rams and half ewes, all as white as the snow that lay still on the summer pasture land, all so imperative in their demands. It was a busy time, and while Andrew and Benj helped those who needed help into the world and set them suckling, Peter took charge of the yearling ewes, who would not lamb until another spring. Biddy was the leader of this group, and she did almost as much for them as Rollo did for the whole flock. Winter did not yield easily that year, but kept coming back for another twist. It was hard for the things growing in the garden, but it was good for the wool. "There's nothing happens on a farm that isn't good somewhere," Andrew exclaimed. "Our crops may be backward, but look at the fleeces." He was standing in the barn, surveying the heavy piles that Benj and Peter were tying together. In the orchard, under the late blossoms of the apple trees, the pink-skinned sheep gamboled as lightly as their lambs, among them a shorn and indignant black one. On the barn floor, a dark fleece, weighing upwards of 6 pounds, and with more than enough wool for a suit of clothes, laid by itself. It belonged to Peter, and was his reward for a year's work. Soon the bundled fleeces would be on their way to the market town, but the fleece of the black sheep would not be with them. There was a woman in the village who spun wool and wove it into cloth. It was to her that Peter went that May evening, when the wind blew across the plowed fields in warm drifts. Near the cottage stood a gnarled old tree, gay with blossoms, and the air was filled with the song of birds. Peter stopped to listen, not only to the song, but to the whir and hush of the spindle that came from inside the cottage. At the door, he raised his hand to knock, loath to break into the soft flow of sound, but proud of the fleece on his back and eager to show it. The sound of his fingers on the wooden panel caused neither spindle nor bird to cease singing, but brought to the door a little girl. She smiled when she saw Peter, for she knew him as the son of the farmer who lived up in the hills. Peter nodded shyly to her, for he had seen her at church on Sunday with her grandmother. "What a fine fleece you have there," she said admiringly. "It's from my cosset," he answered proudly, "and I'd like a coat to wear to school next winter." "What's a coat for a sheep is a long way from being a coat for a boy," a voice said from within the room as the sound of the spinning ceased. "Come in, boy, and show me your wool." Peter stepped into the room. For a moment there seemed to be nothing to it but its trade, for at one end was a great harness loom, and at another was the big spinning wheel. Standing at a distance from the wheel and slowly winding the spun wool stood a tall woman with gray hair and a quiet face. Peter shifted the wool from his shoulders and held it up to her. She fingered it knowingly. Black sheep's wool, that's good, she said, rubbing a bit through her fingers. I'd like enough for a coat, and I want to pay you for it. She looked at the wool and then looked at Peter. Yes, and you'll want the back broad and the sleeves deep hemmed, for your young limbs are stretching out so that it won't fit you long unless it's made that way. When may I have it, and what shall I pay you for it? Peter asked. Not so fast, young man, not so fast. You shall have it before the summer is over, but there is more wool by half than is needed for one coat. Then shall I pay you with the remaining wool? The woman nodded. That is as good a way as any, and Mary shall have a new frock from it, a warm brown one, for she too goes to school this year for the first time. Mary clapped her hands delightedly. With red buttons on it, Granny, please, as shiny red as cranberries in a bog. Red is a good color, and red the buttons shall be. Peter walked home that evening with quick steps. He had made the first bargain of his life, and countryman as he was, he felt that it was a good one.